train medical students studying gallbladder removal. For most of the 20th century, doctors had removed gallbladders by making a long cut in the abdomen and performing open surgery. But since the 1980s, many doctors have been doing the surgery with a laparoscope, a slender tube that can be threaded into the abdominal cavity through a small incision. The scope is equipped with a tiny camera, and the surgeon must navigate through the cavity based on the images the scope transmits. All sorts of injuries can occur if the doctor misreads those images, and it usually takes hundreds of observed surgeries to master the skill. In the experiment, half the students practiced on a computer module that showed short videos from real surgeries and had to decide quickly which stage of the surgery was pictured. The other half, the control group, studied the same videos as they pleased, rewinding if they wanted. The practice session lasted about 30 minutes. On the final test, the perceptual learning group trounced their equally experienced peers, scoring 4 times higher. Kelman has found that his PLMs can accelerate dermatology students' ability to identify skin lesions and rashes, which come in enormous varieties, and often look indistinguishable to the untrained eye. He and Sally Crosney at UCLA Medical School have found similar results in radiology, as well as in reading echocardiograms. Working with other colleagues, Kelman has also achieved good results with a module that prompts chemistry students to categorize chemical bonds between molecules. True, this is all advanced, technical stuff for people who've already done just fine in school. What about the kid watching the clock in math class, trying to figure out what on earth slope means or how to graph 3 equals y? Here, too, perceptual modules have shown great promise. At a school in Santa Monica, Kelman tested a module that works just like the instrument panel trainer, only with equations and graphs. A graph of a line pops up on the computer screen, and below it are 3 equations to choose from. Again, students have to work fast, make a choice and move on, make another choice, and another, through dozens of screens. With enough training, the student begins to feel the right answer, and then they can figure out why it's right afterwards, if they need to, as Joe Wise, the high school teacher working with Kelman, told me. Scientists have a lot more work to do before they figure out how, and for which subjects, PLMs are most effective. You can play computer games all you want, but you still have to fly the plane or operate on a living human being. It's a supplement to experience, not a substitute. That's one reason perceptual learning remains a backwater in psychology and education. It's hardly a reason to ignore it, though. Perceptual learning is happening all the time, after all, and automatically, and it's now clear that it can be exploited to speed up acquisition of specific skills. The promise of this book was to describe techniques that could help us learn more effectively without demanding more effort. The goal is to find more leisure, not less. I'm now about to break that promise, but not shatter it into little pieces. We're going to make a slideshow together. I know. But look, I once made my own flashcards in high school with old-fashioned paper and number 2 pencils. It's just as easy to create a PLM, right here, right now, to show how it can be done, and what it can and can't do. I was determined to be as lazy as possible about this. I subcontracted the work. I hired my 16-year-old daughter to design the module for me, because I'm a busy professional writer, but also because, like many kids, she's digitally fluent. She's perfectly capable of making her own digital slideshows, PowerPoint presentations, or videos, downloading images off the internet. And that's what I told her to do. I also poached the subject matter, or at least the idea. I decided to do exactly what Cornell and Bjork did in their interleaving study of painting styles described in the last chapter, with a few small changes. Those two used interleaving to teach students to distinguish individual styles among landscape artists. I changed that. My module would focus on famous artistic movements, like Impressionism. This wasn't a random choice. My motives here were selfish. I'd been embarrassed on a recent visit to the Museum of Modern Art by how little I knew of art history. I recognized a piece here and there but had zero sense of the artistic and cultural currents running through them. Van Gogh's Starry Night holds the eye with its swimming, blurred sky, but what did it mean for him, for his contemporaries, for the evolution of modern art? I sure didn't know. Fine. I didn't have to know all that right away. I just wanted to know how to tell the difference between the pieces. I wanted a good eye. I could fill in the other stuff later. What kind of perceptual module did I need? This took a little thinking but not much. I had my daughter choose a dozen artistic movements and download 10 paintings from each. That was the raw material, 120 paintings. The movements she chose were Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Romanticism, Expressionism, Abstract Expressionism, Abstract Impressionism, Dadaism, Constructivism, Minimalism, Suprematism, Futurism, and Fauvism. Got all that? You don't have to. The point is that there are many distinctions to make, and I couldn't make any of them. I came into the project with a thick pair of beginner's goggles on. I knew Monet and Renoir were Impressionists, and that was about it. Cornell and Bjork had presented their landscape paintings in mixed sets, and of course that's what I had my daughter do, too. The order was random, not blocked by style. She made a PLM and rigged it just as Kelman did. A painting appears on the screen, with a choice of 12 styles below it. If I chose right, a bell rang and the check symbol flashed on the screen. If I guessed wrong, a black X appeared and the correct answer was highlighted. I trained for as long as I could stand it in a single sitting, about 10 minutes, maybe 60 screens. The first session was almost all guessing. As I said, I had a feel for the Impressionist pieces and nothing else. In the second 10-minute session I began to zero in on minimalism and futurism, baby steps. By session 4 I had Expressionism and Dadaism pretty well pegged. What were the distinguishing features, exactly? Couldn't say. What was the meaning of the unnatural tones in the Fauvist pieces? No idea. I wasn't stopping to find out. I was giving myself a few seconds on each slide, and moving on. This was perceptual learning, not art history. Eventually I had to take a test on all this, and here, too, I borrowed from Cornell and Bjork. Remember, they tested participants at the end of their study on paintings that they'd not studied. The idea is that, if you can spot Braque's touch, then you ought to be able to peg any Braque. That was my goal, too. I wanted to reach a place where I could correctly ID a Dadaist piece, even if it was one I hadn't studied in the PLM. Henri Matisse, Portrait of Madame Matisse, 1905, 2014. Succession H. Matisse Artists' Rights Society, New York. After a half-dozen sessions, I took a test, no thinking aloud, and did well, 30 out of 36 correct, 80%. I was glancing at the paintings and hitting the button, fast. I learned nothing about art history, it's true, not one whit about the cultural contexts of the pieces, the artistic statements, the uses of color or perspective. But I'll say this, I now know a Fauvist from a post-impressionist painting, cold. Not bad for an hour's work. The biggest difference between my approach and Cornell and Bjork's is that interleaving may involve more conscious deliberation. Perceptual modules tend to be faster paced, working the visual systems as well as the cognitive, thinking ones. The two techniques are complementary, each one honing the other. What I'll remember most, though, was that it was fun, from start to finish, the way learning is supposed to be. Of course, I had no exam looming, no pressure to jack up my grades, no competition to prepare for. I've given this example only to illustrate that self-administered perceptual training is possible with minimal effort. Most important, I've used it to show that PLMs are meant for a certain kind of target, discriminating or classifying things that look the same to the untrained eye but are not. To me it's absolutely worth the extra time if there's one specific perceptual knot that's giving you a migraine. The difference between sine, cosine, tangent, cotangent, intervals and cadences in music. Between types of chemical bonds. Between financing strategies, or annual report numbers. Even between simple things, like whether the sum of two fractions is greater or less than 1. Run through a bunch of examples fast, and let the sensory areas of your brain do the rest. This is no gimmick. In time, perceptual learning is going to transform training in many areas of study and expertise, and it's easy enough to design modules to target material you want to build an instinct for quickly. Native trees, for example, or wildflowers. Different makes of fuel injectors. Baroque composers or French wines. Remember, all the senses hone themselves, not only vision. As a parent, I often wish I'd known the dinosaurs better by sight, or had a bead on fish species before aquarium visits. The best part is, as Eleanor Gibson said, perceptual learning is automatic and self-correcting. You're learning without thinking. Chunking, in psychology, is the facility to store studied items in meaningful clusters based on prior knowledge. Take the sequence of letters Y, N, B, C, B, B, C, E, F, I, F, A, C, I, A, M, B, A, Y. Study those for a few minutes, then cover your eyes and try to remember as many as you can. The typical number most of us can remember is about 7. Now try it again after grouping the letters. In this way, Y, NBC, BBC, FIFA, CIA, MBA, Y, you remember more, because you've stored the letters in meaningful groups. Chapter 10. You snooze, you win. The consolidating role of sleep. The giant rabbit hole in our lives, the dark kingdom we all visit regularly, is sleep. Sleep is a perfect mystery for most of us. We need it, we want more of it, and we long for it to be of a deeper, richer quality. On one hand, we know it can betray us on any given night. On the other, we know that there's some alchemy going on during those unconscious, dream-filled hours, some mixing of fact, fantasy, and feeling that can turn our daytime struggles to master new skills into that most precious thing, understanding. You don't have to be a new age dream therapist to believe that the brain makes connections during sleep that it doesn't while awake. Who hasn't sat upright in bed now and then at 3 a.m. and thought, oh, of course, suddenly remembering where you stashed your keys, or visualizing how to alter your golf swing, or to refinger a piece by Albeniz. Countless times I've gone to sleep in a state of self-pitying frustration, held hostage by some story I can't outflank, only to rouse myself in the middle of the night, grab the pen on my nightstand, and scribble out some thoughts that had bubbled to the surface between dreams. In the morning I wake to find a scrawl of partial sentences that, if legible, often help me write my way out. It's not just me, either. The history of scientific discovery is salted with hints that sleep fosters profound intellectual leaps. The 19th century German chemist Friedrich August Kekulé, for example, claimed that he stumbled upon the chemical structure of benzene, in which the molecule curls into a ring shape after dreaming of snakes biting their tails. The Russian scientist Dmitry Mendeleev reportedly pulled several all-nighters, to no avail, trying to piece together what would become his famous periodic table of the elements, but it was only after nodding off, he told a colleague, that he saw a table where all the elements fell into place. These kinds of stories always remind me of the Grimm's fairy tale The Golden Bird, in which a young man on a mission to find a magic bird with golden feathers falls in love with a princess, whose father the king will grant her hand on one condition, that the young man dig away the hill that stops the view from his window in 8 days. The only complication? This is no hill, it's a mountain, and after 7 days of digging, the young man collapses in defeat. That's when his friend the fox whispers, "Lie down and go to sleep, I will work for you." And in the morning, the mountain is gone. Sleep is the stuff of legends and fairy tales precisely because it's so unknown, a blank screen onto which we can project our anxieties and hopes. If the darkroom is locked, we can only guess at what images are being developed in there. All of which raises the question, what is the sleeping brain doing, exactly? For that matter, why do we sleep at all? The truth is, no one knows. Or, to be more precise, there's no single, agreed-upon scientific explanation for it. We spend fully a third of our existence unconscious, so any theory about sleep's central purpose has to be a big one. Doesn't the body need regular downtime to heal? To relieve stress? To manage moods, make muscle, restore mental clarity? Yes to all of the above. We know that sleep deprivation makes us more reckless, more emotionally fragile, less able to concentrate and possibly more vulnerable to infection. None of those amounts to an encompassing theory, though, because none explains the vast variations in sleep times and schedules. Just think of how dramatically sleep habits differ from person to person. Some people thrive on as little as 3 hours a night, while others feel helpless. Without 8, some function best awake all night and out most of the day, others need their daily nap. A truly comprehensive theory of sleep, then, would have to explain such differences. It would also need to account for the sleep-wake cycles in animals, which is breathtaking in its diversity. Female killer whales can be mobile and alert for upward of 3 weeks when looking after a newborn calf, nearly a month without sleep. Migrating birds fly for weeks without stopping to rest. 2 new theories have emerged that make sense of this chaos. One is that sleep is essentially a time management adaptation. Our body's internal clock evolved to keep us out of circulation when there's not much of a living to be made, at 3 a.m., for instance, and awake when there is. Consider the brown bat, perhaps the longest sleeping mammal of them all. It sleeps 20 hours a day and spends the other 4, at dusk, hunting mosquitoes and moths. Why only 4 hours at dusk? Because that's when food is plentiful. But also because, as Jerome Siegel, a neuroscientist at UCLA, says, increased waking time would seem to be highly maladaptive for this animal, since it would expend energy and be exposed to predatory birds with better vision and better flight abilities. Siegel argues that our obsession with sleep quality and duration is, in a sense, backward. We spend a third of our life sleeping, which seems so maladaptive, the biggest mistake nature has made, scientists often call it, he told me. Another way of looking at it is that unnecessary wakefulness is a bigger mistake. When there's hay to be made, we make it, whether the sun is shining or not. And when there's none, or too little, given the risks of being out and about, we bed down. In short, sleeping and waking adjust themselves to the demands and risks of our life, not according to what the health manuals say. The other theory is that sleep's primary purpose is memory consolidation. Learning. In recent years, brain scientists have published an array of findings suggesting that sleep plays a critical role in flagging and storing important memories, intellectual and physical. Also in making subtle connections, a new way to solve a tricky math problem, for example, or to play a particularly difficult sequence of notes on the viola, that were invisible during waking. Think about what we described back in Chapter 1, all those streaming sensations, the sheer, insane volume of neural connections the brain has to make in the course of any given day. At some point, we have to decide which of these connections are worth holding on to, and which can be ignored. That's an easy choice sometimes, and we make it immediately. A new colleague's name, the pickup time at daycare, which house on the street has the angry Dobermans. Other choices are not obvious at all. Some of the most critical perceptions we register in a day contain subtle clues, shrugs, sideways glances, suggestions, red herrings. A world of impressions swirls in our heads when we turn the lights out and, according to this theory, that's when the brain begins to sort out the meaningful from the trivial. In the contentious field of sleep research, these 2 theories are typically set in opposition, one trumping the other as the primary function of our unconscious lives. In reality, they are hardly mutually exclusive. Only by putting them together, in fact, can we begin to understand how sleep aids learning, and to use that understanding to our advantage. The boy's brain was going haywire, but he was fast asleep, out cold. His father called his name, Armand? Armand? No response. Was he pretending? No, it sure didn't look that way. It was December 1951, and Eugene Aserinsky, a young graduate student at the University of Chicago, had brought his 8-year-old son, Armand, to his basement lab to perform an experiment on sleep. Aserinsky was studying for a degree in physiology and trying to build his credentials as an experimental scientist. He had little interest in sleep research as a career. He was only here pulling night duty, on orders from his academic advisor, Nathaniel Kleitman, who happened to be the father of modern sleep science. Aserinsky had been tinkering with a machine called an Offner dynograph to track the sleeping brain. A forerunner to the EEG, the dynograph registers electrical signals from the brain, through electrodes taped to the skull. Aserinsky was using Armand as his test subject. He'd taped a couple of electrodes to the boy's head and eyelids and then tuned the machine from the next room, asking his son to look this way and that, calibrating the dials. Gradually, Armand nodded off and Aserinsky, sipping his coffee, watched as the dynograph settled, its ink pens tracing smaller, smoother waves, as expected. But after a few hours the waves began to spike, all of them, those coming from Armand's eyelids as well as his brain, as if the boy was awake and alert. Aserinsky got up from his chair and slipped into the room where his son lay, to make sure his son was asleep and safe. Armand? Armand? No answer. Aserinsky returned to the next room, and watched the dynograph. Scientists at the time considered sleep a period when the brain essentially shut down, becoming a playground for the unconscious, a canvas for dreams. The dynograph said differently. Aserinsky paced the lab, flabbergasted, he would say later, by the frenzied wave activity, and watched as Armand's brain waves settled down again, the pens ceasing their chatter. It was late, there was no one else around. Was he seeing things? If so, then reporting the finding would be potentially embarrassing, written off as the misplaced exuberance of an inexperienced researcher. If not, his son's sleeping brain could be telling him something that no one suspected about unconsciousness. He brought Armand back into the lab for another session weeks later, to see if his original observation was a fluke. It wasn't. At various periods during the night, Armand's brain leapt to life as if he were wide awake. Aserinsky was now confident that this pattern was no mirage. The question was, what was triggering these eye movements? He said years later. What do they mean? He didn't have enough expertise in the field or its experimental techniques to know. He'd have to go to the top, to Kleitman, and ask whether such odd brain activity had been reported in sleep experiments before, and whether it was worth the time to follow up. Kleitman didn't hesitate. Study more people, he told Aserinsky. You might be onto something. By late 1952, Aserinsky had upgraded his equipment and embarked on a study of 24 adults. Their brain patterns looked just like Armand's, periods of slow undulations, punctuated by bursts of intense activity. The flare-ups had no precedent in the sleep research literature, so he wasn't even sure what to call them. He consulted Kleitman again, and the two of them reviewed the data. If they were going to report such an unusual finding and claim it was universal, they'd better be sure of their measurements. Their report finally appeared in September of 1953 in the journal Science. The paper was all of 2 pages, but Aserinsky and Kleitman did not undersell the implications of their work. The fact that these eye movements, this EEG pattern, and autonomic nervous system activity are significantly related and do not occur randomly suggests that these physiological phenomena, and probably dreaming, are very likely all manifestations of a particular level of cortical activity which is encountered normally during sleep. They concluded, an eye movement period first appears about 3 hours after going to sleep, recurs 2 hours later, and then emerges at somewhat closer intervals a third or fourth time shortly prior to awakening. They eventually settled on a more scientific-sounding name for the phenomenon, rapid eye movement, or REM, sleep. This was really the beginning of modern sleep research, though you wouldn't have known it at the time. William Dement, then a medical student in Kleitman's lab and now a professor of psychiatry and sleep medicine at Stanford University, told me. It took years for people to realize what we had. One reason for the delay was lingering infatuation with an old theory. In the 1950s many brain scientists, particularly in the United States, were still smitten with Freud's idea that dreams are wish fulfillment, played out in fantasy and symbolic imagery that's not accessible during waking. Money poured into sleep research, but it was used to investigate the content of dreams during REM, not the mechanics or purpose of REM per se, and to little avail. People roused from REM described a tangle of anxieties, fantasies, and nonsense scenes that said nothing consistent about human nature. It was exciting work to do, but in the end we weren't able to say anything conclusive, Dement told me. Still, those dream studies and others confirmed beyond any doubt that REM was universal and occurred periodically through the night, alternating with other states of unconsciousness. In fact, people typically experience 4 or 5 bursts of REM during the night, of 20 to 30 minutes in duration, as the brain swims up to the brink of consciousness before diving back down again. By 1960, sleep scientists began to speak of sleep as having at least 2 dimensions, REM and non-REM, or NREM. Later, using EEG recordings as well as more specific electrical recordings from the eyes and eyelids, researchers found that NREM has its own distinct stages as well. The definition of these stages is arbitrary, depending mostly on the shape and frequency of the waves. The light sleep that descends shortly after we doze off was called stage 1. This is when the brain's jagged waves of conscious awareness begin to soften. In stage 2, the waves become more regular, resembling a sine wave, or a clean set of rollers moving toward shore on a windless day. In stages 3 and 4, the waves gradually stretch out, until they undulate gently like a swell over open ocean, a slow wave pattern that signals the arrival of deep sleep. The brain cycles though its 5 sleep stages in order, from stage 1 down to stage 2, deeper to stage 3, and bottoming out at stage 4, before floating back up, through stages 3 and 2, and then into REM. The cycle then repeats throughout the night, dropping down again to stage 4 and back up, to REM. These 4 stages and REM describe what scientists call sleep architecture, which maps easily onto a graph. The discovery and description of this previously hidden architecture did more than banish the notion, once and for all, that our brains simply power down at night, becoming vessels for dreams. It also begged a question: if the brain is so active while we sleep, what's it up to, exactly? Nature doesn't waste resources on this scale. With its bursts of REM and intricate, alternating layers of wave patterns, the brain must be up to something during sleep. But what? To do science, you have to have an idea, and for years no one had one. J. Allen Hobson, a psychiatry professor at Harvard, told me. They saw sleep as nothing but an annihilation of consciousness. Now we know different. One reason that palace intrigue makes for such page-turning fiction or addictive TV is what psychologists call embedded hierarchy. The king is the king, the queen, and there are layers of princes, heirs, relatives, ladies-in-waiting, meddling patriarchs, ambitious newcomers, and consigliere types, all scheming to climb to the top. Which alliances are most important? What's the power hierarchy? Who has leverage over whom? You have no idea until you see the individuals interact. And if you don't see them square off one-on-one, you play out different scenarios to see if you can judge the player's relative power. Could Grishilda have Thorian shackled and tossed in the moat if the two clashed? She is a favorite of the king's, after all. Yet Thorian might have some connections up his sleeve. Wait, who's his mother again? Learning scientists like embedded hierarchy problems because they model the sort of reasoning we have to do all the time, to understand work politics as well as math problems. We have to remember individual relationships, which is straight retention. We have to use those to induce logical extensions. If A greater than B and B greater than C, then A must be greater than C. Finally, we need to incorporate those logical steps into a larger framework, to deduce the relationships between people or symbols that are distantly related. When successful, we build a bird's eye view, a system to judge the relationship between any two figures in the defined universe, literary or symbolic, that's invisible to the untrained mind. In a 2007 study, researchers at Harvard and McGill universities tested college students' ability to discern an embedded hierarchy in what looked like a simple game. The research team asked the students to study pairs of colored eggs, one pair at a time, on a computer screen. The eggs were ranked one over another. For example, the students were split into 2 groups, one studied the eggs in the morning, one studied them in the evening. Both groups memorized the relative ranks of the pairs quickly and aced a test on them just afterward. But 12 hours later, the groups got another test, asking them to rank eggs they'd not seen directly compared. This is the embedded Grishilda-Thorian question, and the answer is not so obvious. If aqua trumps rainbow, does that mean it also trumps paisley? And what about coral? Does it rank third, or fourth? The students never got to see the entire ranking of all the eggs while studying, so it was hazy. It was hazy, that is, until they slept on it. The group that studied in the evening and took the test the next morning after a night's sleep, the sleep group, as they were called, scored 93% on the most distantly related pair, i.e., the hardest question. The group that studied in the morning and took the test in the evening, without having slept, the wake group, scored 69% a full 24 hours later. Each student took the test yet again, and the sleep group's advantage had increased on the most distantly related pairs. That's a large difference on the hardest questions, 35%, separating one kind of student from another, but it's not unusual in studies of sleep and learning. We think what's happening during sleep is that you open the aperture of memory and are able to see this bigger picture, the study's senior author, Matthew Walker, told me. There is evidence, in fact, that REM is this creative memory domain when you build different associations, combine things in different ways and so on. In a game like this one, he and his co-authors argue, we are very good at building separate categories of associations, but the more obscure relationships between those categories are harder to sort out, until we sleep. The investigation of sleep as consolidator of learning is still a work in progress. After scientists chasing Freud hit a wall in the 1960s, sleep research, like its nocturnal subjects, dropped off the deep end. The money tapered off. The window Eugene Aserinsky had opened, revealing REM sleep, seemed, for a time, to expose little more than another dark room. You had this great excitement, basically followed by 40 years of nothing. It was just horrible, Robert Stickgold, a neuroscientist at Harvard, told me. But in the past 2 decades, dozens of studies like Walker's have brightened the horizon, turning sleep into one of the most promising, and contentious, frontiers of learning science. The preponderance of evidence to date finds that sleep improves retention and comprehension of what was studied the day before, and not just for colored eggs. It works for vocabulary, word pairs, logical reasoning, similar to what's taught in middle school math, even the presentation you'll be giving at work, or the exam that's coming up at school. For all of these, you need to memorize the details of important points and to develop a mental map of how they fit together. The improvements tend to be striking, between 10 and 30%, and scientists don't understand the dynamics of unconscious states well enough yet to explain why. My own theory is that sleep amplifies many of the techniques we've discussed in this book. The spacing effect described in Chapter 4, for instance, is especially strong with intervals of a day or two. Philip Ballard's reminiscence, that puzzling improvement in memory of the wreck of the Hesperus poem described in Chapter 2, crested in the first day or two. A good night's sleep could surely loosen the fixedness that makes it hard to see a solution to the pencil problem, discussed in Chapter 6, right away. The brain is likely doing many of the same things with information while asleep as it does while awake, or at least performing complementary functions. The story hardly ends there, however. Scientists have begun to study the effects of interrupting particular stages of sleep, like REM, to isolate the impact those stages have on learning specific skills or topics. Remember, sleep has 5 dimensions that we know of, REM, and the 4 stages surrounding it. Our brain waves have distinct patterns in each of those periods, suggesting that different mental dynamics are at work in each one. Could it be that each stage is specialized to consolidate a specific kind of skill, whether it's a geometric proof, a writing assignment, or a tennis serve? Many scientists now suspect so, based on evidence that comes from both animals and humans. These findings have coalesced into a remarkable hypothesis, first described in 1995 by Italian scientists led by Antonio Guidito at the University of Naples Federico II. The idea has since been fleshed out by others, mostly Robert Stickgold at Harvard and Carlisle Smith of Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, who have contributed enough experimental heft to make this model of sleep learning a full-grown theory, the most comprehensive explanation yet for how the different stages of sleep consolidate memory. Technically, I suppose, we should call this idea the Godeta-Smith-Stickgold model of learning consolidation. I prefer to call it, simply, the night shift theory. The lights go out, and basic maintenance is done. Here's what the night shift theory says happens overnight, during each stage. Stage 1, this one is a scratch. It's impossible to deprive people of stage 1 light sleep, if they're going to sleep at all. Its role in consolidating memories is hard to isolate, though it's often laced with REM-like periods. REM, these storms of neural firing appear to aid pattern recognition, as in the colored egg experiment, as well as creative problem solving and perceiving relationships that weren't apparent during the day, as in a difficult calculus problem. It likely plays the largest role, of all the stages, in aiding percolation. People still get these benefits from sleep sans REM, just not to the same degree. REM is also involved in interpreting emotionally charged memories. We believe that it's during REM that the brain strips away the visceral feeling experienced at the time an emotional memory is formed. Matthew Walker, the Berkeley brain scientist who co-authored the colored egg study, told me, but holds on to the actual information, the details, the where and when of what happened. That panic you felt the last time you opened a geometry exam. It's better to have that feeling stripped, or at least reduced, so you can recall what the panic-inducing problems actually were. Walker describes REM as a nighttime therapy session. Stage 2, this is the motor memory specialist. In a series of little-known studies, Carlisle Smith trained people in what he calls the rotor task. This is a hand-eye coordination exercise in which people have to use their non-writing hand to chase a moving spotlight across a computer screen using a joystick. It's easy enough to improve and people generally do, but not as quickly if they're deprived of stage 2 sleep. Stage 2 seems to be the single most critical stage for motor learning, Smith told me. When we deprive people of stage 2, we don't see that same level of improvement, and we believe the findings extend to all types of motor learning, whether it's music or athletics and possibly mechanical skills. Stages 3 and 4, these two are usually lumped together in learning research as slow wave or deep sleep. This is prime retention territory. Starve people of deep slumber, and it doesn't just dim their beauty, they don't get the full benefit of sleep-aided recall of newly learned facts, studied vocabulary, names, dates, and formulas. We have a lot of evidence that slow wave is important for declarative memory consolidation, and that this doesn't happen as much in REM, Stickgold told me. To put all this in some perspective, let's dial up the sleep architecture graph once more. The first thing to note about this diagram is that it traces the architecture for a person who, in this case, goes to sleep at 11 p.m. and wakes up at 7 a.m. The architecture looks roughly the same for everyone, though, no matter what time he or she regularly goes to bed and wakes up, in an important sense, getting the usual doses of all 5 stages is the meaning of a full night's sleep. Each stage somehow complements the other's work. Where it really gets interesting is when we alter our usual sleep schedule to prepare for some performance, whether a speech, a tryout, or an exam. Notice, for example, that the longest stretch of stage 2 sleep is just before waking. Cut that short and you miss out on the period when your brain is consolidating a skateboarding move, a difficult piano fingering, or your jump shot. The implication is that if you are preparing for a performance, a music recital, say, it's better to stay up late than get up early, Smith told me. These coaches that have athletes or other performers up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I think that's crazy. The same logic applies to REM. The largest dose is in the early morning, between those chunks of stage 2. If you're prepping for a math or chemistry test, an exam that's going to strain your ability to detect patterns, better to stay up late and, if possible, hit the snooze button in the morning. Let the cock crow till he's hoarse. Deep sleep, On the other hand, pools in the front half of a typical night's slumber, as you can see from the diagram. That's the slow wavelength you want when preparing for a test of retention, like new vocabulary, or filling in the periodic table. Arrange your studying so that you hit the sack at your regular time, get a strong dose of the deep stuff, and roll out of bed early for a quick review before dawn. All of this is to say that if you're going to burn the candle, it helps to have some idea of which end to burn. Here's the best part, you may not have to burn it at all. Napping is sleep, too. In a series of experiments over the past decade, Sarah Mednick of the University of California, San Diego, has found that naps of an hour to an hour and a half often contain slow-wave deep sleep and REM. People who study in the morning, whether it's words or pattern recognition games, straight retention or comprehension of deeper structure, do about 30% better on an evening test if they've had an hour-long nap than if they haven't. It's changed the way I work, doing these studies, Mednick told me. It's changed the way I live. With naps of an hour to an hour and a half, we've found in some experiments that you get close to the same benefits in learning consolidation that you would from a full 8th night's sleep. Learning is hard. Thinking is hard. It's as exhausting, though in a different way, as physical labor and wears most of us down at a similar rate. Yes, some people can spend 14 hours a day doing grueling mental work and then relax by solving puzzles or attending poetry readings by some Eastern European exile. Good for them. Me, I fall more squarely in the Michael Gazzaniga camp of learning. Gazzaniga, the neuroscientist who discovered the right brain-left brain specialization we explored in Chapter 1, worked long days and nights in the lab at Caltech on his landmark studies. We had all these people at Caltech back then who became big names: Richard Feynman, Roger Sperry, Murray Gell-Mann, Sidney Coleman, but we weren't working all the time, Gazzaniga told me. We weren't intellectuals in the sense that we were going out to see people lecturing or cultural events in the evening. That was martini time. And we're almost there. Let's return to Jerome Siegel's theory of sleep, the one we described at the beginning of the chapter. He argues that sleep evolved to keep us safe when the hunting and gathering was scarce or too risky. We are awake when the foraging is good, when socializing in the group is important, and asleep when there's no percentage in pursuing any of the above, when the costs are too high. Sleep occupies so much time because it's so central to immediate, day-to-day survival. It's no stretch to say, however, that learning, in school, at work, at practice, is equally crucial to the survival game. Mastering a subject or skill may not be as urgent as avoiding some saber-toothed cat, but over a lifetime our knowledge and skills become increasingly valuable, and need to be continually updated. Learning is how we figure out what we want to do, what we're good at, how we might make a living when the time comes. That's survival, too. Yet, especially when we're young, we have a terrible time trying to sort out what's important from what's not. Life is confusing, it moves fast, we're fielding all sorts of often conflicting messages and demands from parents, teachers, friends, and rivals. There aren't enough hours in the day to think through what it all means. That's reason enough to suspect that what the brain does at night is about more than safety. The sleep-wake cycle may have evolved primarily to help us eat and not be eaten, but if that downtime can be put to good use, then evolutionary theory tells us it will. What better way to sift the day's perceptions and flag those that seem most important? A tracking skill. A pattern of movement in the bushes. An odd glance from a neighbor. A formula for calculating the volume of a cone. A new batting stance. A confounding plot in a Kafka novel. To sort all that variety, sleep might absolutely evolve distinct stages to handle different categories of learning, whether attention or comprehension, thermodynamics or Thucydides. I am not arguing that each state of sleep is specialized, that only REM can handle math and only deep sleep can help store Farsi verbs. Anyone who's pulled an all-nighter or two knows that we don't need any sleep at all to learn a pile of new material, at least temporarily. I am saying the research thus far suggests that each of sleep's 5 stages helps us consolidate learning in a different way. Siegel's theory tells us that exhaustion descends when the costs of staying up outweigh its benefits. The night shift theory gives us the reason why, because sleep has benefits, too, precisely for sorting through and consolidating what we've just been studying or practicing. Seen in this way, it's yin and yang. Learning crests during waking hours, giving way to sleep at the moment of diminishing returns, when prolonged wakefulness is a waste of time. Sleep, then, finishes the job. I've always loved my sleep, but in the context of learning I assumed it was getting in the way. Not so. The latest research says exactly the opposite, that unconscious downtime clarifies memory and sharpens skills, that it's a necessary step to lock in both. In a fundamental sense, that is, sleep is learning. No one is sure how the brain manages the sensory assault that is a day's input, biologically. The science of sleep is still in its infancy. Yet one of its leading theorists, Giulio Tononi of the University of Wisconsin, has found evidence that sleep brings about a large-scale weakening of the neural connections made during the previous day. Remember all those linked neural networks forming every moment we're awake? Tononi argues that the primary function of sleep is to shake off the trivial connections made during the day and help consolidate the valuable inferences that were made. The brain is separating the signal from the noise, by letting the noise die down, biologically speaking. Active consolidation is likely going on as well. Studies in animals have found direct evidence of crosstalk between distinct memory-related organs during sleep, as if the brain is reviewing, and storing, details of the most important events of the day, and integrating the new material with the old. I sure don't know the whole story. No one does, and maybe no one ever will. The properties of sleep that make it such an unreliable companion, often shallow, elusive when most needed, or arriving when least wanted, also make it difficult to study in a controlled way over time. It's likely that the sleep stages, arbitrarily defined by brainwave changes, may be replaced by more precise measures, like the chemical cocktails circulating during sleep states, or different types of crosstalk. My bet, though, is that the vast promise of tweaking sleep as a means to deepen learning will tempt someone into longer-term experiments, comparing the effects of different schedules on specific topics. Those effects will likely be highly individual, like so many others described in this book. Some night owls may find early morning study sessions torturously unproductive, and some early birds get their chakras spent out of joint after 10 p.m. At least with the night shift theory, we have some basis on which to experiment on our own, to adjust our sleep to our advantage where possible. Put it this way, I no longer think of naps or knocking off early as evidence of laziness, or a waste of time, or, worst of all, a failure of will. I think of sleep as learning with my eyes closed. Conclusion. The foraging brain. I began this book with the allegation that most of our instincts about learning are misplaced, incomplete, or flat wrong, that we invent learning theories out of whole cloth, that our thinking is rooted more in superstition than in science, and that we misidentify the sources of our frustration, that we get in our own way, unnecessarily, all the time. In the chapters that followed, I demonstrated as much, describing landmark experiments and some of the latest thinking about how remembering, forgetting, and learning are all closely related in ways that are neither obvious nor intuitive. I also showed how those unexpected relationships can be exploited by using specific learning techniques. What I have not done is try to explain why we don't know all this already. If learning is so critical to survival, why do we remain so ignorant about when, where, and how it happens? We do it naturally, after all. We think about how best to practice, try new approaches, ask others we think are smarter for advice. The drive to improve never really ends, either. By all rights, we should have developed pretty keen instincts about how best to approach learning. But we haven't, and the reasons why aren't at all apparent. No one that I know of has come forward with a convincing explanation, and the truth is, there may not be one. I do have one of my own, however, and it's this: school was born yesterday. English class, intro to trig, study hall, soccer practice, piano lessons, social studies, art history, the Russian novel, organic chemistry, Zeno's paradoxes, jazz trumpet, Sophocles and sophomore year, Josephus. And gym class, modern poetry and ancient civilizations, all of it, every last component of what we call education, is a recent invention in the larger scheme of things. Those ancient civilizations we studied in middle school? They're not so ancient, after all. They date from a few thousand years ago, no more. Humans have been around for at least 1 million, and for the vast majority of that time we've been preoccupied with food, shelter, and safety. We've been avoiding predators, ducking heavy weather, surviving by our wits, foraging. And life for foragers, as the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker so succinctly puts it, is a camping trip that never ends. Our foraging past had some not so obvious consequences for learning. Think for a moment about what it meant, that lifelong camping trip. Hunting and tracking were your reading and writing. Mapping the local environment, its every gully, clearing, and secret garden, was your geometry. The science curriculum included botany, knowing which plant had edible berries and which medicinal properties, and animal behavior, knowing the hunting routines of predators, the feeding habits of prey. Over the years you'd get an education, all right. Some of it would come from elders and peers, but most of it would be accumulated through experience, listening, watching, exploring the world in ever-widening circles. That is how the brain grew up learning, piecemeal and on the fly, at all hours of the day, in every kind of weather. As we foraged for food, the brain adapted to absorb, at maximum efficiency, the most valuable cues and survival lessons along the way. It became a forager, too, for information, for strategies, for clever ways to foil other species' defenses and live off the land. That's the academy where our brains learn to learn, and it defines who we are and how we came to be human. Humans fill what the anthropologists John Dewey and Ervin DeVore called the cognitive niche in evolutionary history. Species thrive at the expense of others, each developing defenses and weapons to try to dominate the niche it's in. The woodpecker evolved an extraordinary bone structure to pound holes in tough bark and feed on the insects hidden in trees. The brown bat evolved an internal sonar, called echolocation, allowing it to hunt insects at dusk. We evolved to outwit our competitors, by observing, by testing our intuitions, by devising tools, traps, fish hooks, theories, and more. The modern institution of education, which grew out of those vestigial ways of learning, has produced generations of people with dazzling skills, skills that would look nothing less than magical to our foraging ancestors. Yet its language, customs, and schedules, dividing the day into chunks, and off hours into study time, has come to define how we think the brain works, or should work. That definition is so well known that it's taken for granted, never questioned. We all know we need to be organized, to develop good, consistent study routines, to find a quiet place and avoid distractions, to focus on one skill at a time, and above all, to concentrate on our work. What's to question about that? A lot, it turns out. Take concentration, for example, that most basic educational necessity, that mental flow we're told is so precious to learning. What is concentration, exactly? We all have an idea of what it means. We know it when we see it, and we'd like more of it. Yet it's an ideal, a mirage, a word that blurs the reality of what the brain actually does while learning. I remember bringing my younger daughter to my newspaper office one weekend a few years ago when she was 12. I was consumed with a story I had to finish, so I parked her at an empty desk near mine and logged her into the computer. And then I strapped in at my desk and focused on finishing, focused hard. Occasionally, I looked up and was relieved to see that she was typing and seemed engrossed, too. After a couple hours of intense work, I finished the story and sent it off to my editor. At which point, I asked my daughter what she'd been up to. She showed me. She'd been keeping a moment-to-moment log of my behavior as I worked. She'd been taking field notes, like Jane Goodall observing one of her chimpanzees. 1046, types 1046, scratches head. 1047, gets papers from printer 1047, turns chair around 1048, turns chair back around 1049, size 1049, sips tea. 1050, stares at computer. 10:51, puts on headset. 10:51, calls person, first word is dude. 10:52, hangs up. 10:52, puts finger to face, midway between mouth and chin, thinking pose. 10:53, friend comes to desk, he laughs. 10:53, scratches ear while talking, and so on, for 3 pages. I objected. She was razzing me, naturally, but the phone call wasn't true, was it? Did I make a call? Hadn't I been focused the whole time, locked in, hardly looking away from my screen? Hadn't I come in and cranked out my story without coming up for air? Apparently not even close. The truth was, she could never have invented all those entries, all that detail. I did the work, all right, and I'd had to focus on it. Except that, to an outside observer, I looked fidgety, distracted, unfocused. The point is not that concentration doesn't exist, or isn't important. It's that it doesn't necessarily look or feel like we've been told it does. Concentration may, in fact, include any number of breaks, diversions, and random thoughts. That's why many of the techniques described in this book might seem unusual at first, or out of step with what we're told to expect. We're still in foraging mode to a larger extent than we know. The brain has not yet adapted to fit the vocabulary of modern education, and the assumptions built into that vocabulary mask its true nature as a learning organ. The fact that we can and do master modern inventions like Euclidean proofs, the intricacies of bond derivatives, and the fretboard hardly means those ancient instincts are irrelevant or outmoded. On the contrary, many scientists suspect that the same neural networks that helped us find our way back to the campsite have been repurposed to help us find our way through the catacombs of academic and motor domains. Once central to tracking our location in physical space, those networks adjusted to the demands of education and training. We don't need them to get home anymore. We know our address. The brain's internal GPS, it long ago evolved internal communities of so-called grid cells and place cells, to spare us the death sentence of getting lost, has retuned itself. It has adapted, if not yet perfectly. Scientists are still trying to work out how those cells help us find our way in modern-day learning. One encompassing theory is called the meaning maintenance model, and the idea is this: being lost, confused, or disoriented creates a feeling of distress. To relieve that distress, the brain kicks into high gear, trying to find or make meaning, looking for patterns, some way out of its bind, some path back to the campsite. We have a need for structure, for things to make sense, and when they don't, we're so motivated to get rid of that feeling that our response can be generative. Travis Prue, a psychologist at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, told me. We begin to hunger for meaningful patterns, and that can help with certain kinds of learning. Which kinds? We don't know for sure, not yet. In one experiment, Prue and Stephen J. Heiner, a psychologist at the University of British Columbia, found that deliberately confusing college students, by having them read a nonsensical short story based on one by Franz Kafka, improved their performance by almost 30% on a test of hidden pattern recognition. Similar to the colored egg test we discussed in Chapter 10. The improvements were subconscious, the students had no awareness they were picking up more. Kafka starts out normally, the first couple pages make you think it's going to be a standard narrative and then it gets stranger and stranger, Prue told me. Psychologists don't really have a word for the feeling that he creates, but to me it goes back to the older existentialists, to a nostalgia for unity, a feeling of uncanniness. It's unnerving. You want to find your way back to meaning, and that's what we think helps you to extract these very complex patterns in this artificial grammar, and perhaps essential patterns in much more that we're asked to study. When we describe ourselves as being lost in some class or subject, that sentiment can be self-fulfilling, a prelude to failure or permission to disengage entirely, to stop trying. For the living brain, however, being lost, literally, in some wasteland, or figuratively, in the wasteland, is not the same as being helpless. On the contrary, disorientation flips the GPS settings to hypersensitive, warming the mental circuits behind incubation, percolation, even the nocturnal insights of sleep. If the learner is motivated at all, he or she is now mentally poised to find the way home. Being lost is not necessarily the end of the line, then. Just as often, it's a beginning. I have been a science reporter for 28 years, my entire working life, and for most of that time I had little interest in writing a non-fiction book for adults. It was too close to my day job. When you spend 8 or 9 hours a day sorting through studies, interviewing scientists, chasing down contrary evidence and arguments, you want to shut down the factory at the end of the day. You don't want to do more of the same, you don't want to do more at all. So I wrote fiction instead, 2 science-based mysteries for kids, adventures in made-up places starring made-up characters. As far from newspapering as I could get, the science itself is what turned me around. Learning science, cognitive psychology, the study of memory, call it what you like. The more I discovered about it, the stronger the urge to do something bigger than a news story. It dawned on me that all these scientists, toiling in obscurity, were producing a body of work that was more than interesting or illuminating or groundbreaking. It was practical, and not only that, it played right into the way I had blossomed as a student all those years ago, when I let go of the reins a bit and widened the margins. I was all over the place in college. I lived in casual defiance of any good study habits and also lived, more so than I ever would have following good study habits, with the material I was trying to master. My grades were slightly better than in high school, in much harder courses. In a way, I have been experimenting with that approach ever since. The findings from learning science have allowed me to turn my scattered non-strategy into tactics, a game plan. These findings aren't merely surprising. They're specific and useful. Right now. Today. And the beauty is, they can be implemented without spending a whole lot more time and effort and without investing in special classes, tutors, or prep schools. In that sense, I see this body of work as a great equalizer. After all, there's so much about learning that we can't control. Our genes, our teachers, where we live or go to school. We can't choose our family environment, whether dad is a helicopter parent or helicopter pilot, whether mom is nurturing or absent. We get what we get. If we're lucky, that means a sensuous education of the James family variety, complete with tutors, travel, and decades of in-depth, full immersion learning. If we're not, then not. About the only thing we can control is how we learn. The science tells us that doing a little here, a little there, fitting our work into the pockets of the day is not some symptom of eroding concentration, the cultural anxiety du jour. It's spaced study, when done as described in this book, and it results in more efficient, deeper learning, not less. The science gives us a breath of open air, the freeing sensation that we're not crazy just because we can't devote every hour to laser-focused practice. Learning is a restless exercise, and that restlessness applies not only to the timing of study sessions but also to their content, i.e., the value of mixing up old and new material in a single sitting. I've begun to incorporate learning science into a broad-based theory about how I think about life. It goes like this: just as modern assumptions about good study habits are misleading, so, too, are our assumptions about bad habits. Think about it for a second. Distraction, diversion, catnaps, interruptions, these aren't mere footnotes, mundane details in an otherwise purposeful life. That's your 10-year-old interrupting, or your dog, or your mom. That restless urge to jump up is hunger or thirst, the diversion a TV show that's integral to your social group. You took that catnap because you were tired, and that break because you were stuck. These are the stitches that hold together our daily existence. They represent life itself, not random deviations from it. Our study and practice time needs to orient itself around them, not the other way around. That's not an easy idea to accept, given all we've been told. I didn't trust any of these techniques much at first, even after patting my college self on the back for doing everything right. Self-congratulation is too easy and no basis for making life changes. It was only later, when I first began to look closely at the many dimensions of forgetting, that my suspicion ebbed. I'd always assumed that forgetting was bad, a form of mental corrosion. Who doesn't? As I dug into the science, however, I had to reverse the definition entirely. Forgetting is as critical to learning as oxygen, I saw. The other adjustments followed, with trial and error. For example, I like to finish. Interrupting myself a little early on purpose, to take advantage of the Zeigarnik effect, does not come naturally to me. Unfortunately, I have no choice. Being a reporter, not to mention a husband, dad, brother, son, and drinking partner, means having to drop larger projects, repeatedly, before having a chance to sit down and complete them. Percolation, then, is a real thing. It happens for me, all the time, and without it I could never have written this book. Applying these and other techniques has not made me a genius. Brilliance is an idol, a meaningless projection, not a real goal. I'm continually caught short in topics I'm supposed to know well, and embarrassed by what I don't know, yet even that experience smells less of defeat than it once did. Given the dangers of fluency, or misplaced confidence, exposed ignorance seems to me like a cushioned fall. I go down, all right, but it doesn't hurt as much as it once did. Most important, the experience acts as a reminder to check and recheck what I assume I know. The science of learning is not even science to me anymore. It's how I live. It's how I get the most out of what modest skills I've got. No more than that, and no less. I will continue to follow the field. It's hard not to, once you see how powerful the tools can be, and how easily deployed. The techniques I've laid out here are mostly small alterations that can have large benefits, and I suspect that future research will focus on applications. Yes, scientists will surely do more basic work, perhaps discovering other, better techniques and more complete theories. The clear value of what's already there, however, begs for an investigation into how specific techniques, or combinations, suit specific topics. Spaced interleaving may be the best way to drive home math concepts. For instance, teachers might begin to schedule their final exam for the first day of class, as well as the last. Late night, mixed drill practice sessions could be the wave of the future to train musicians and athletes. Here's one prediction I'd be willing to bet money on: perceptual learning tools will have an increasingly central role in advanced training of surgeons and scientists, as well as pilots, radiologists, crime scene investigators, and more, and perhaps in elementary education as well. Ultimately, though, this book is not about some golden future. The persistent, annoying, amusing, ear-scratching present is the space we want to occupy. The tools in this book are solid, they work in real time, and using them will bring you more in tune with the beautiful, if eccentric, learning machine that is your brain. Let go of what you feel you should be doing, all that repetitive, overscheduled, driven, focused ritual. Let go, and watch how the presumed enemies of learning, ignorance, distraction, interruption, restlessness, even quitting, can work in your favor. Learning is, after all, what you do.